Hello everyone and welcome to week 2 of FINC245. For today's video lecture, we're going to be going over contracts or contract law. This topic will be split into 3 sections, and this will be part 1 of 3. The second section will look into different forms of contracts, and the third section will look at liability on the part of CPAs. So, for this first section of contracts, we will divide it into 2 subsections. We'll first look into the nature and classification of different types of contracts. So we'll look into what are the basic elements for formation of a legal contract by law. Then we'll look into 4 different types of contracts. They would be express contracts, implied contracts, unilateral contracts, and bilateral contracts. After we do that, we'll look into more the mutual assent element of contracts, which is formed of offer and acceptance, and I will define those for you as we continue forward. So, first topic is formation. So, a contract is formed when its elements, mutual assent, consideration, capacity, and legality are present. Keep in mind that a writing is not required to form a contract. A contract may be legally enforceable even if the terms of the contract were not reduced to a writing. Although there are some subsets of contracts that do require a writing, most contracts do not. And therefore, from a legal perspective, a legal contract may be formed just between 2 individuals talking on the side of the street, provided that all of the elements of a contract are there. So, if a valid enforceable contract is formed, the law provides remedies if an obligation under the contract is breached. The law applies an objective standard, or in this case we call a reasonable person standard, to determine whether a contract was formed or breached. So this is the preliminary look at what a contract is. Essentially, if an exchange between 2 parties, whether it be between an individual to an individual to a business, or a business to a business, then what is the purpose of forming a legal contract? Well, that is, if the terms of an agreement are not met, then the person that is harmed by the contract, in this case being what we call breached, the law will provide remedies if an obligation is not fulfilled. That's the legal importance and a practical reason why we are learning about this topic is if a valid contract was formed in the legal sense, then on the legal side, there will be remedies for an injured party. So that's why contract law is very important. It's a legal designation that has legal remedies attached. So keep that in mind. So there are 2 types of contracts that are both legal, but they come about in different ways. The first one is an express contract. So an express contract is one in which the parties have stated the terms either in writing or orally. So pretty self-explanatory. It's, I promise to pay you $100 if you clean my house, and if you want to do this, then start cleaning my house. And then at that point, if you did clean my house and I don't pay you the $100, then then you would have a remedy to sue me for that $100. And that would be an example of an express contract. So what if it's not stated? What if there's no exchange of words whatsoever? So that's what we call an implied contract. So the terms of an implied contract are wholly or partially inferred from conduct and circumstances, but not from written or spoken words. So, in this case, a contract is implied in fact if the facts indicate that there was a contract. So, see this example. Kelly makes an appointment with a hairdresser. Kelly keeps the appointment and permits the hairdresser to cut her hair. Kelly has promised through her actions to pay for the haircut. A court will infer from Kelly's conduct that an implied contract was formed and a duty to pay was understood and agreed to. So in this case, Kelly and the hairdresser never exchanged any words, but based upon Kelly's actions and the hairdresser's actions, then what we would call this legally a contract that's implied in fact. And the reason why is they're clearly based upon Kelly's actions of making an appointment, keeping the appointment, allowing the hairdresser to actually cut her hair, means that while not spoken, there was an informal implied contract for Kelly to pay the hairdresser money for cutting her hair, because in every other circumstance in which a person does this, there is money involved. So in this example, it's easy to see that the facts indicate that a contract was formed. So those are these two distinctions of express and implied. Next, we go to unilateral and bilateral. So this is another second distinction between different contracts. Remember, the first one was the fact that it could be in writing or spoken. The second distinction is it could either be stated explicitly or implied in fact. And then this third distinction to keep in mind is there one party making a promise to do something, or are both parties making promises to do something? So if only one party makes a promise to do something, we call this a unilateral contract. So this means that only one party is what we designate as a promisor. So there's always a promisor and a promisee. The promisor is the person making a promise to somebody called a promisee. We can sometimes call this the offeror or the offeree, and these terms are used interchangeably in most examples. So in a unilateral contract, only one party makes a promise. The other party is an actor, not a promisor. If he or she performs a defined action, which we would define as an acceptance, the promisor is obligated to keep the promise. So look at this example. Amy tells Bill, "I'll pay you $10 to polish my car." This offer is for a unilateral contract. Amy, the promisor, expects Bill, the actor, to accept the act by polishing her car, not by making a return promise. So what we call a unilateral contract is simply an offer in which the means to accept is by conducting a certain actions. So if Bill, in this case, goes and polishes her car, we assume that Bill, as the offeree or the actor here, is able to accept it legally because Amy has told Bill exactly what he needs to do in order to get the $10. So we call this a unilateral contract, or sometimes we also call this a contract by which acceptance or performance constitutes acceptance. Performance usually just means the action that has to be done, or the conduct or the refraining from acting that a person needs to do. So what does a person need to do or not do to accept the contract? And we call that performance. So in a bilateral contract, which is typically the contracts that are abound throughout all of our society, we call this a bilateral contract if both parties make promises. So see this example. Amanda tells Bill that she will provide him lodging in September if he agrees to pay her $200. This is an offer for a bilateral contract. If Bob accepts and promises to pay the $200, a bilateral contract is formed. And then in this case, once it's formed, then we let time pass to see if Amanda actually lets Bill stay in her lodging in September, and we'll wait to see if Bob actually pays the $200. What happens after the contract is formed is just performance of the contract in general. Here, we're really only looking at formation, is what actually needs to be there in the facts and circumstances of the parties in which will decide that, yes, a legal contract is formed. Yes, if one of these parties don't actually commit, or if one of the parties commit and don't actually do the agreement that they promised, what will be the remedies for breach of that contract? So just remember, we're only looking at if a contract was formed or not whether liability imparts on who or whoever. Simply, we just need to answer that first question: is a contract formed or not? And when we ask these questions, these different designations are what needs to be kept in mind, which is simply that there's express contracts that are where the terms are stated in writing or orally. There's implied contracts where, based upon the actions of somebody, an offer and acceptance is implied. And then we look to see if the acceptance is either on both sides, or it's just by performance in a unilateral contract, or if both parties make promises in which offer and acceptance are there. So here's some other classifications that you should keep in mind. And perhaps these first 4 slides aren't put into the correct context, but trust me, if you watch through this video for today's class, you'll have a much better understanding, because the next few slides will go into the basics of what offer and acceptance constitute. So here are other classifications. So a valid contract has all the elements of a contract, and the law provides a remedy if breached. A valid contract is legally binding on both parties. So this first bullet is just talking about what I went over, is in order for a contract to be legally binding on the people involved and for a hurt party in an arrangement to get compensation or remedies through a court, then the contract has to be called valid. And for validity, that just simply means all the elements of a contract are there. So next, an unenforceable contract is a valid contract that has all the elements of a contract, but the law will not enforce it because there's other rules. So see this example. Jane enters into an oral contract to sell land to Emily. To be enforceable, a contract for the sale of land must be in writing. Because the real estate contract was not written, it is not enforceable. So this is simply when you're looking at whether or not a contract was formed, you may determine, okay, it's valid, it's formed, but is there something in the law that makes it unenforceable regardless? And in this example, it would be if a contract were to sell land, that has to be in writing by the law. Therefore, that would be an unenforceable contract, although valid. Next, a party may choose to either enforce or nullify a voidable contract. So what is a voidable contract? A voidable contract is a contract in which it's valid, there's no additional legal requirement that makes it unenforceable, but it's nevertheless voidable because it was entered into through, let's say in this example, fraud or intentional deception. Here, Adam was induced to enter into a contract by Ben's intentional deception, i.e. fraud. Adam can choose to either enforce the contract or void the contract since it was fraudulently induced. Adam can also collect damages against Ben for any loss sustained due to fraud. So a contract that was entered into via intentional deception by the part of a party is voidable, and therefore Adam doesn't even have to go through with the contract due to fraud. Obviously, he would have to prove that there was fraud, but that's a different consideration. Lastly, a void contract is not binding and is considered void since its inception. A void contract cannot be ratified and enforced. So, very interesting is it could be a valid contract that has all the elements of a contract. It may not have a legal requirement that makes it unenforceable. It's not necessarily voidable. It's actually void because you can't make a contract for somebody to commit a crime. It's not recognized as a contract. And that's what you need to keep in mind.